All right, John chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. As always, we want to get an overview of where we're at in the book of John. We're in the main section called the book of signs. And so what we've seen already, the chapter 5 was about the Sabbath. This section here, these chapters are about the different feasts of Israel, the Sabbath, and then we have the Passover, which is going to be our chapter today. And then we're going to see Sukkot and Hanukkah. And so Passover is going to be a major theme throughout the book of John chapter 6. Now here's an overview, an outline of John chapter 6. And just based on the outline itself, you can see where the meat of the chapter is. It's on the second half of the chapter. But it starts off with Yeshua feeding the 5,000. He feeds the 5,000, and within that he multiplies the fish and the bread to feed the 5,000 even more. And then at the end of that section, it says the people want to make Yeshua king. They want to seize him by force. And then there's a little interlude in this chapter, which we're going to go over today, was where Yeshua walks on water, which is all going to culminate into the second half of the chapter. So just like in John chapter 5, you had the first half of the chapter setting up the major discourse of the meat of the chapter. It's the same way here. You had the first 21 verses setting up the discourse of the rest of the chapter. All right, so and we're going to go over this. And so the second chapter is where we're going to go over next week, the meat of the chapter. But let's go over it real quick so we can get our overview. So after Yeshua walks on water with the disciples, they get off the boat. They're in Capernaum. The people start looking for Yeshua. So where is he at? And so they get in their boats and they go on the other side of the lake, as we'll see. And the people seek Yeshua on the other side of the lake, verses 22 to 25. And as soon as they get there, they ask Yeshua, how did you get here? And Yeshua immediately rebukes them for not seeing the sign he performed the previous day. And then the people ask for a sign, and they want a man like Moses. So, well, if you're truly this prophet, show us a sign like Moses. But Yeshua explains their lack of unbelief. And this is a major point on John chapter 6. He's explaining why they don't believe, which we'll see next week. And then, of course, as always, Yeshua's teachings are misunderstood, both misunderstood by the people and his disciples, which is a common theme throughout the book of John. And at the end of the day, only 12 disciples are left. So just looking at this overview, just think for here for a second. Yeshua starts off with 5,000 strong followers. He feeds them, and they're happy with him. At the end of John chapter 6, everyone leaves him but the 12. It doesn't sound like Yeshua's ministry is going too well, does it? But this is happening according to plan. And Yeshua is going to explain why this is in John chapter 6. So what's going on in John chapter 6? We start with 5,000, and he ends up only with 12. We're going to see. Okay, so let's just give you an overview of John chapter 6. John chapter 6, verse 1. It says, afterwards, Yeshua went away to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they were watching the signs he was performing on the sick. Then Yeshua went up to the high mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Passover, the Jewish feast, was near. Now, when we left John chapter 5, it seems as though many months have passed since John chapter 5, and some estimate at least about 6 months have passed since John chapter 5. So when it says afterwards, it just literally in the Greek it says sometime later. So many months have passed, and during this time, John the Baptist has probably been killed, right? And the government is looking for Yeshua. And so a lot has happened. The 12 disciples have already been established. They've been going around preaching throughout the book of Galilee, the land of Galilee. We saw in the beginning of John 1, or John chapter 2, it was Passover, right? And now we're getting here in the middle of John chapter 6. So almost a year has passed since we started John. It says here that the Sea of Galilee is also called the Sea of Tiberias. The Sea of Tiberias is what the Romans would call it. And so again, John is writing to those who may not be familiar with the land of Israel. Those who might have been outside the land. Well, what is the Sea of Galilee? I don't know what that is. Oh, the Sea of Tiberias. Okay, I know what that is. All right, so this gives some indication that he's not writing for Jews only. He's also writing for a general group that's outside of the land or not Jews at all. So he's writing to a mixed group. Okay? In verse 2, it says, notice the motivation of why the people were following Yeshua. They weren't following Yeshua because, hey, his teaching is great. We believe he's the Son of God. He's the Messiah. They were following him specifically because they saw the signs, right? Well, he hasn't given food yet. That's later. But they saw the signs of healing the sick and said, oh, this guy is great. This is going to come into play later in John chapter 6. So John is kind of setting all this up. But notice the motivation of what John is saying that they're following Yeshua here. And in verse 3, Yeshua went to go sit down with his disciples to be alone with them, and later he noticed the crowds. So this is just an idea. He's going up to the mountain to sit down, and he's looking down as he's sitting with his disciples. We'll see in verse 5. And then he sees the crowds, and he makes a comment, as we'll see here in a moment. In verse 4, remember that John mentions Passover because it will be important to the following teaching with all the feasts mentioned in chapter 5 through 11. So he's not just mentioning Passover because he's trying to give you the time of year, because it's very important to the dialogue that's going to happen at hand, okay? So it is not so much chronological that he mentions Passover, but it's more theological that he's talking about Passover. And this is coming to a major theme of the book of John in chapter 6, all right? When we think of Passover, what do we typically think of when we think of Passover? We usually think of redemption, food, sacrifice, and the parting of the Red Sea. These ideas will be played out in the rest of the book of John chapter 5. I'm sorry, John chapter 6. Okay, so these themes, the food, the parting of the Red Sea, redemption, all these things will be seen in John chapter 6. So this is John is, again, setting us up for the following dialogue. Okay, now I always like to see when we see locations from one place to another in the text. I always like to get a visual of what it looked like in the first century. So when we look here, we can see that this is the Sea of Galilee, and on the east side is where Yeshua was near Bethsaida. Okay, and this is the green part was his feed the 5,000. He was on the east side. And eventually we're going to see they're going to cross the sea on the other side to Capernaum. That's to the northwest of the Sea of Galilee. Okay, and there's several miles between that. So it's a very, very large lake, but it's several miles going across, as we'll see later. All right, so that gives you a visual picture of where they're at as far as Galilee is concerned. Verse 5, Yeshua lifting up his eyes, and seeing a large crowd coming to him, Yeshua said to Philip, where will we buy food? Where will we buy bread for these may eat? Now Yeshua was saying this to test him, for he knew what he was about to do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii isn't enough to buy bread for each to get a little bit. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what's that for so many? Okay, so let's break this down a little bit. So again, like I said before, Yeshua is sitting down with his disciples. He looks up and he sees the people coming to him. Now, again, this is the only major quote unquote miracle or sign that's all the synoptic gospels mentioned. So all 4 gospels mention this, so we can compare and contrast this with the other gospels. Now, Mark is most closest to John here, which is interesting. Now, when you look at Mark and the other gospels, it says that Yeshua saw the crowds and he had compassion upon them and wanted to feed them. Here, Yeshua asks Philip to buy bread because he is from Bethsaida. So that's why Yeshua asked Philip, because we saw in John 1:44 that Philip is from Bethsaida, and when we looked at the map, Bethsaida is just north of where they were staying at this time. And so, all right. So in verse 6. Yeshua was asking this question not because he had any interest in buying food for them, right? He was asking to test Philip. Now, when he says he was testing Philip, what was the test? He's testing his faith, okay. In what way is he testing his faith? So Yeshua had a plan. It was part of his plan. So what was the test? It was to get Philip and the rest of the disciples to think out of the natural world, right? To go trust in God who can provide for their needs. Because obviously he wasn't expecting them to buy the food for all the people, but he was asked to say, was Philip going to trust in the idea of God providing for the people, or was he just going to look at the natural world and say, I don't have any money. We don't have enough money. And of course, it doesn't look like Philip really passed the test here. And again, this is a precursor of what we can see in the rest of the book of John, chapter 6. Looking at the natural rather than the spiritual, in a sense. All right. So in verse 7, he says, there's not even 200 denarii will feed all these people. 200 denarii is about 8 months' wages in the first century. So most of the money that people earned in the first century was to pay for their food. And so 8 months is about 2/3 of the year of paying for their food to provide for them. So he's saying, look, not even that much will be able to feed all these people. And now Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, makes a suggestion. He says here, now there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Now what's interesting, and this is going to come, we'll talk about this a little later, but the word here for boy can mean a young boy or can mean a young servant, a young attendant, as we'll see. So this is the same Greek word here. Well, that's going to become important later. Now, when it says barley loaves, I think this is the only place. John is the only person out of all the Gospels that actually mentioned what kind of bread that they had. And barley loaves, the barley loaves was an inexpensive for the common people, and especially the poor man's food. Is basically what it was commonly thought. So it was a type of bread that was very cheap, and the poor mostly ate it. And so this is what's providing the poor man's bread and some fish to feed all these thousands of people. What are we going to do? Well, verse 10, it says, and Yeshua said, make the people recline. There was much grass in the area, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Then Yeshua picked up the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed bread to everyone who was reclining. And he did the same with the fish, as much as they wanted. When the people were full, Yeshua said to his disciples, gather up the leftovers, so nothing is wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets of broken pieces from the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had finished eating. Okay, so obviously something miraculous happened, right? 5 loaves and 2 fishes were enough to feed 5,000 men, and possibly not including women and children. And on top of that, they had 12 baskets left over. So what they started off with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, they ended up left over more than what they started with, which is interesting. All right. Now in verse 10, it says here there was much grass. It says here there was much grass in that area. If you look at Mark, which is Mark 6, which is the parallel passage to this section here, Mark 6:30, it says it calls it green grass. Now, why is that important? Well, there's some in the Hebrew roots movement and others who are trying to deny that this was not during the Passover. That they're trying to get away from the idea that Yeshua's ministry was 3.5 years, trying to say his ministry was only 2 years for some mathematical reason. I don't know. But regardless of that, barring the fact that John says that happened during Passover, when you look here, when it says the grass was green, this is most likely referring to the springtime, which is during Passover time, because the grass was still green here before the summer, where it starts to yellow from the hot sun. So there's another testimony this is happening during the springtime as well. Yes. No, not necessarily. No, because I think you eat barley bread all year round. Yeah. As far as I know. Yeah. As far as I know, it's not just in the spring, not just in the fall. Sorry. But I could double check for you. But I think it's an all year round type of bread. Okay. Okay, so in verse 11, it says Yeshua gave thanks, and depending on your translation, some translations might say he blessed the food, which is not entirely accurate. Jewish people don't bless the food like a lot of Christians do. They bless God for giving them the food. And so when he says he gave thanks, literally he gave a blessing to God, and probably said the hamotzi, as we're probably all familiar with. And then it says here in verse 11, it says he, meaning Yeshua, distributed the bread. Now, what's interesting about it is that in John, it says Yeshua is the one who distributed bread, but the other synoptics say that the disciples distributed the bread. Now, is this a contradiction? What's going on here? Well, most likely is that Yeshua wasn't the only one going around distributing bread to 5,000 people while the disciples are sitting there with their hands in their pockets going, wow, that's a lot of work. Most likely they were helping Yeshua distribute the bread. Okay, so is John lying here? Well, not necessarily. He's not saying that Yeshua is the only person to distribute the bread. But here we get the idea of what is called agency. We talked about this last week too. Agency is that even though John is saying that Yeshua is distributing the bread, and the disciples were distributing the bread, doesn't mean there's a contradiction. What it's just saying is that the disciples were distributing on behalf of Yeshua. So that's the idea. They were as his agent or their representative in passing out the bread. Now, why is this important? Well, is because John is emphasizing not that the disciples are passing out bread, but Yeshua. But why? Why would that be the case? Well, John specifically says that it is Yeshua who gave out the bread to emphasize the fact that he is the source and provider of the bread of life. That he gives his bread to the world. As you see so far in the chapters, where he's the source of the rebirth, the living water, and of healing. So it's just these little tidbits like that John is giving us, emphasizing that it's Yeshua who went out and gave the bread and distributed the bread. And so, again, he's just emphasizing that fact. Just these little tidbits I think was kind of fascinating. And so in verses 11 to 12, everyone was satisfied and had as much as they wanted. In other words, nobody went hungry. They didn't run out of food. Obviously, we know they had food left over. So everyone ate to their full. Right? And then verses 12 to 13, there was more left over than what they started with, which I already mentioned. Now, it mentions 12 baskets. So why 12 baskets? Well, there's two reasons why 12 baskets are mentioned. Probably making reference to the 12 tribes of Israel, right? The Lord had enough to supply the needs of all the 12 tribes of Israel. I think that's a valid point. The other two is referring to the 12 disciples. One basket per disciple, right? And the number is mentioned in verse 70. So at the end of John chapter 6, the number 12, Yeshua says, are you not the 12? And yet one of you is a devil. So the word 12 is mentioned at the end of chapter 6, referring to probably making reference to the 12 baskets. Now, when we go through the story of the feeding of the 5,000, there's many applications we can talk about. How to apply this to our lives and all the things. I don't want to spend too much time talking about that. I'm trying to focus on the main themes of the book of John, but I'm sure there's a lot of sermons on this section here about the feeding of the 5,000. So I don't want to get into too many applications here as well. But what's interesting about this story, I was mentioned before, is that there's a parallel story of this in the Tanakh. Which is probably what John is driving from the Tanakh here. So when we go to 2 Kings 4, 43 to 44, it says this. It says, now a man came from Bala Shalicha and brought the man of God bread of the firstfruits. Now this is referring to Elijah. Loaves of barley bread and fresh ears of corn in his sack. Then he said, give them to the people that they may eat. But his attendant, meaning Elijah's attendant, said, what? Will I set this before 100 men? But Elijah said, give them to the people that they may eat. For thus says Adonai, they will eat and they will have left over. So he sat it before them, and they ate, and they had some left over according to the word of Adonai. So here we say this is, so what's interesting about this, not only do we have a miraculous feeding of here distributing to 100 men of these loaves that were given to him, the barley loaves, by the way, but also it says they had some left over, just like we see in the story of the feeding of the 5,000. But on top of that, when you look at the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, in verse 42, it says, and his attendant said, now that Greek word for attendant is the same Greek word mentioning the boy who had the barley, the five loaves and 2 fish. So it's the same word, attendant or servant, as I mentioned earlier. So again, there's a play on words, a play on themes here. And again, this is pointing to not only to Moses and the Passover theme, but also pointing to Elijah. So even Yeshua is greater than the prophet Elijah. So where Elijah only fed 100 men, Yeshua feeds 5,000 men. All right. So moving on, then we have here the tail section of the feeding of 5,000 in verses 14 to 15. When the people saw the sign that Yeshua performed, they began to say, this is most certainly the prophet who is to come into the world. Realizing that they were about to come and seize him by force to make him king, Yeshua withdrew again to the mountain, himself alone. Okay, so when in verse 14, when it refers to the prophet, it's most likely referring to the prophet in Deuteronomy 18, verses 15 through 19, which was also mentioned in the book of John, chapter 1, verses 21, when they're asking about it. Elijah says, are you the Messiah? Are you Elijah? Are you the prophet? Right? So that's most likely making reference to that as well. But also note, again, this is something that I'm going to keep drawing on. Notice the word world here. The definition of the word world doesn't mean people. It means the realm, okay? So, again, I'm just going to keep harping the fact every time you see the word world doesn't always mean the same thing, and especially in the book of John. It means different things according to its context. Okay? So I wanted to read here a little bit from this scholar. He says this. He says, doubtless, Yeshua's provision of so much bread to so many people in the wilderness area prompted some to think of Moses' role in providing manna. Toward the end of the 3rd century A.D., Rabbi Isaac argued that as the former Redeemer caused manna to descend, so the latter Redeemer will cause manna to descend. Perhaps the same sentiment coursed through some of the circles of the 1st century. Against some contemporary commentators, it is important to note that John does not argue that the people were wrong in this judgment, but only in their estimate of its significance. Their attention was focused on food, we'll see that in verse 26, and victory, which we see in verse 15, and not on the divine self-disclosure manifested through the incarnate Son, not on the Son as the bread of life, and not on the realistic assessment of their own need, meaning their spiritual need. So again, this is a theme here. The people are so concentrated on this world problems, they're not looking at the sign, what the sign pointed to, which is Yeshua and their need for a Savior. Right? They're so focused on this world, they're not looking to God necessarily. And so that's just really what's going on here. So they're wanting to make him king, and why they want to make him king? Because they thought the Messiah would come and be a political figure, and he was going to get them out of the subservient of the Rome and come and restore Israel and be a big warrior like David. That was the typical picture of the Messiah in the 1st century. And Yeshua would have none of that. Because when he saw they were going to make him king by force, he immediately secluded himself away from them. Now, in verse 15, although Yeshua would be king, because we know he would be king of kings, right? The manner in which he would receive his kingship is important. Just as in chapter 5, Yeshua does not need man to testify for him, so he does not need man to help him or force him to become king. He will later say to Pilate in 1836, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would be fighting so that I wouldn't be handed over to the Judean leaders. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here. Now, when he says this to Pilate, what does he mean, my kingdom is not from here? Is he not king of the earth? Well, of course he is. So what does he mean that his kingdom is not from here? Well, the Greek in there from, or comes from, is the idea of source. Is what he's saying is that my kingdom is not derived from men's power and ability, not from this world. It comes from something outside of this world. So the source, who's going to make him king, is God himself. He doesn't need the help of men. He doesn't need the testimony of man. He doesn't need men to help him fight for his kingdom. He has God on his side, essentially what he's saying. And so, again, we should take this into account, especially when we're studying the book of John. How often are we so focused on our world, what's going on in our political realm, what's going on in Israel, instead of looking towards our God and asking for his advice and his opinion, rather than listen to all these other political commentators? Okay? Sometimes we need to turn the TV off and forget politics for a moment and just focus on God and what he's doing. And I think that was what was going on in the first century. People were tired of Rome. They're tired of their stress, their suffering, and that they just wanted that taken care of rather than looking at what the big important picture is. Okay. So what I want to do here is we'll take a pause here and I'll look at the structure, because I think it's the structure of how John sets this section up is rather interesting. And it's, again, a chiastic structure. And since this is going to be a shorter class today, I figured we'd spend some time looking at the structure of the class. So the first one here that starts off with says, the people saw the sign, Yeshua goes up to a mountain. But it ends with, the people saw a sign, and Yeshua goes up to the mountain. So you can see the first and the last, the bookend that's going on here. All right, the second section is, Yeshua asks where to buy and eat. He asked Philip that question in verses 5 through 7. But in verse 13 it says, leftovers are from those who have eaten. All right, so looking for food, and now at the end of it, they've eaten. Verses 8 and 9, one of the disciples suggests barley bread and fish. But at the end, the disciples collect 12 baskets of barley bread. So it mentions it twice there, barley bread twice. In the middle section, it says, Yeshua orders the people to recline. But in verse 11, it says, those who were reclining ate. So use the same word again. So we can see the pattern here. And of course, in a chiastic form, the middle part is what everything's pointing to, the most important. It says this, Yeshua took the bread, gave thanks, and distributed it. Again, emphasizing the fact that Yeshua is the source of life. We should be giving thanks, and he's the one who gives it to us. Okay, so I thought that was pretty nice looking at it from that perspective, and another way of looking at John. Again, we don't spend a lot of time looking at these forms because it will take a long time to look at every section, but I wanted to spend time looking at here. For the very next reason is for the next slide. Okay, so as we've been going through the book of John, we've been keeping track of the 7 signs of John. Here are the 7 signs. Of course, they also form a chiastic structure. And so the first one, we talked about turning the water to wine in chapter 2, the healing of the son in chapter 4, and the healing of the sick man in chapter 5. And so each one represents the hidden glory, death and life, and the inner and outer healing. But when you get here, what does this represent? The feeding of 5,000? Well, it represents the bread from heaven. The bread from heaven. So notice it doesn't have a parallel to the other 6 signs, because this is what everything's pointing to. Yeshua is the bread of life, which is interesting is that chapter 6 is the longest chapter in the book of John. But so we saw the first sign was the water turning into wine, which represents wine, right? So what does this sign represent? Well, it represents bread. Everyone seeing a pattern here? Because when we take the arrow and we start from the wine to bread and go to the very bottom, what do we see? The sacrifice of Yeshua. So it's setting up that structure, as we'll see as we go through each one, as we go through the book. Okay. All right. So moving on to the next section in chapter 6. Now, when evening came, Yeshua's disciples went down to the sea. Going into the boat, they set out to cross the sea towards Capernaum. By now, it had become dark, and still Yeshua had not come to them. A great wind began to blow, stirring up the sea. After they had rowed about 25 or 30 strata, they caught sight of Yeshua walking on the sea, approaching the boat, and they were terrified. Okay, so it seems Yeshua sends out the disciples away from the crowds, most likely because he didn't want them getting caught up in some political mess. And so he sends them out, and he himself hides from them. Well, again, he knew what was going to happen. This was all part of his plan, as we saw earlier. Okay, so they got into the sea or the lake, right? And getting into the boat, they set out across towards Capernaum, as we saw in the picture. And now it became dark. Now, when we talk about the introduction, and we talk about in John chapter 3, whenever darkness is mentioned, there's some spiritual application for it, right? We saw Nicodemus. Nicodemus approached Yeshua at night because of his lack of faith, right? But in the opposite, when he approaches the woman at the well, he approaches her in a midday, right? In the afternoon, when the sun is bright, and she has faith. Okay, and then we see later on when Judas goes to betray Yeshua, John says, and it was night, meaning that something bad's going to happen, something of a lack of faith is happening. Okay, so here, what we see here is what's the connection between darkness here? They're in the darkness without Yeshua, right? That's the connection. So the connection between being at night and the darkness is the absence of Yeshua. This is what John is trying to link here, because obviously it's evening and it's nighttime. Of course, it's going to be dark. Okay. In verse 19, it says they went about 25 to 30 strata, which is about 3 to 3.5 miles. So they were way, and they weren't in the middle of the lake. They were more towards the shore. So they were towards, because there's not. If you look at Galilee as a circle, they were from one edge to one edge like this, not straight through. So they didn't go through the middle of the water. So that's if you've ever seen Galilee, it's a very big lake. I've been there. It's pretty amazing. Now again, this is interesting. Is that in this book studying the book of John, I never realized how many times water is mentioned in the book of John. If you really, because I went back and I stopped and I went through every single chapter in the book of John so far, and the water is mentioned in every single chapter so far. And I think there's going to be one exception later on in the coming chapters. But water is mentioned every single time because, again, water and the Spirit is linked together in the book of John. You must be born of water and Spirit. He talks to a woman at a well. Drink from this water of life, and you'll be thirsty again. The man in the pool need to be cleansed in the water, et cetera, et cetera. John the Immerser was baptizing in water. Just constant theme of water and the Spirit. And here they're on the water in a stormy water without Yeshua. And then Yeshua comes, as we'll see, he calms the storm and enters the boat. So again, it's just these little themes that keep popping up. And this is why I encourage you to look at that handout as you read, if you ever study the book of John, to see if those themes keep coming up. You'll start seeing things you didn't see before. Oh, I didn't notice that, because you're having those themes in mind as you're reading it. Okay. So they were terrified not only of the storm, but also because they see Yeshua. Now, again, John is very succinct here. There's really no dialogue with Peter walking in the water or anything like that. There's really no talking except for one phrase that Yeshua says here, because this is the next verse. But what John is trying to show, this is a transition story from the two end parts of the chapter. Okay. So then verse 20, it says, but Yeshua says to them, I am, don't be afraid. Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and right away the boat reached the shore where they were headed. Now, a lot of people make a big deal about the I am statement here in verse 20. I am, do not be afraid. Now, when you're reading the cursory Greek, this is just another way of saying I am, it is I. Okay? There's really nothing special about the I am statement here, ego eimi, here. However, that being said, it is curious of how John does use the word ego eimi, I am, in his statements. So if you're just looking at the book of John cursory, you're not going to really pick up anything here. But a person that's read John over and over again will start picking up these subtle hints of the I am statement here. So although I wouldn't use this in a debate trying to prove that Yeshua is God by saying this I am statement here in verse 20, it is interesting that these I am statements, there are 7 I am statements he makes mention of himself. We'll talk later in another study of how they kind of work together, how they kept building up to the climax, as we'll see here later in the book of John, chapter 6. So that's just something to keep in mind. We'll talk about more later when we get to the more I am sayings there. And there's actually another chiastic structure I didn't include today that includes this chiastic structure in that. So we'll talk about that another time. All right. So what's interesting about it too is if those who know the Tanakh really well and the background of the Hebrew people, the sea is most of the time, if not always, referring to chaos, or is referring to chaos or disorder, right? So going back to Genesis 1, right? The water, the Spirit was over the waters, the sea, right? And God took disorder, chaos, and He caused it to come order to make creation, right? Throughout the Psalms and the prophets, the sea is always the chaos creatures, the sea monsters. Yet God rules over the chaos and sea monsters. And of course, this again, Yeshua is walking on the sea, showing that He's over chaos, He is over death. He can trample on over those things as well. So there's just the idea, that theme of, and then even the book of Revelation. I think we mentioned this before. At the end, at the end of Revelation, He says, "I saw new heavens and earth, and there was no more sea." The sea was gone. Why is there no more sea? Because the chaos and death and disorder and destruction has been done away with in the new heavens and earth. So when we look at verse 21, there's a possibility there's another miracle going on here. It says perhaps 21 alludes to another miracle or sign to get them to the destination immediately, because it almost sounds like as soon as Yeshua enters the boat, they're already at their destination. Like something happened to transform there immediately. When you compare it with the book of Mark, He gets in the boat and He calms the seas down, right? He immediately calms the seas down by speaking to the seas, and they look at that and they say, "Wow, he is truly the Messiah," right? And then they get to their destination. But John kind of telescopes that and saying they immediately got to their destination. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is most likely has in mind, again, to another story or event that happened in the Tanakh. When we compare this story of the walking in the sea with Psalm 107, 23, 30, it says this: "Some go out to the sea in ships, doing business on the mighty waters. They saw the works of Adonai and His wonders in the deep. For He spoke and raised a stormy wind, lifting up towering waves. They mounted up to the sky and plunged down to the depths in their peril. Their souls melted away. They reeled and staggered like a drunk, and all their skill was bewildered. So they cried out to Adonai in their distress, and He brought them out of their troubles. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves were hushed. They were glad when it became calm, and He led them to their desired haven." So when you kind of read that and you compare it to the story, he enters the boat, he calms the waves, and as soon as he gets in the boat, they enter their destination, very similar to Psalm 107. So it's good to know the Tanakh really well, so when you actually read these stories or these narratives, we can see how well they relate to what came previously. Okay, so what's interesting about this is, how does this story place with John chapter 6? Because we start off with the feeding of the 5,000, and then the second part of the last part of John chapter 6 has to do with the bread of life, that He's the bread that comes down from heaven, et cetera, et cetera. But it seems as though, just looking at the narrative, that this story seems out of place in what's going on here. Why is John mentioning the walking on water in John chapter 6? Well, there's lots of good reasons for it. Well, the first reason is just a natural reason. Right, he explains how Yeshua and disciples get to Capernaum on the other side of the lake, and that makes sense from a historical perspective. They're on one side of the lake, and now they get to Capernaum and the synagogue there, and then they enter another dialogue with the Jewish people there. But that's not a lot of fun, is it? So there's more than what's going on there. The other thing is, it is tied to the Exodus theme of the parting of the Red Sea. So, like I said earlier, Moses is known for two great miracles in the Tanakh, right? He's known for giving the people manna from heaven, right? which because they were hungry in the wilderness, and God gave them manna. But it's also known as parting the Red Sea, the great story. You can't have a good Exodus story or a story of Moses without him parting the Red Sea. And so here the idea is that Yeshua is not parting the Red Sea; he's on top of the sea. He's over the sea. He doesn't have to travel through it; he travels over it. And so that theme there with the Exodus story is still intact with the Passover theme, what's going on. But more importantly, it has to do with the structure of the whole chapter itself. And again, we're not going to do the whole chapter today, but that's just something to keep in mind of the chapter itself. So thematically, it shows the needs of men. And what I mean by this, our need for God and our needs sometimes we don't necessarily think we have. All right, so in the people were hungry and in need of food. And we saw this in verses 2 through 13. Yeshua looks up, sees them hungry. He wants to feed them. They have a need, right? But this is actually in reference. This is addressed in John 6, 26 to 59, where he addresses their need for spiritual food, right? He says, "Eat my flesh and drink my blood. In order to have life in you." He's addressing their spiritual need. They're only seeing the physical sign, but they're not seeing what the sign actually points to. Okay, but all those two, the disciples were the ones in the boat. The disciples were in a storm and in need of saving. They were in need of saving on the boat. But at the end of John chapter 6, verses 60 through 71, Yeshua addresses the disciples' need for the spirit and of life. So again, the first half is referring to the crowd, focusing on the crowd, and the second half is referring to the disciples themselves. And then the second half of John 6, Yeshua talks to the crowd, and the end of John chapter 6, now he focuses on just his disciples. So we can see that going back and forth, how the structure works there. What I find here is interesting again is that in John 60 to 71, which we'll get to next week, is again he mentions specifically his disciples, you need the spirit and of life, and this is referring to when they're on the water. So again, water and spirit are linked again, thematically speaking. Okay, we'll see again. This is a theme we'll see throughout the book of John: the water and spirit. Okay. So let's look at the themes here. So even though it was only 21 verses, there's still themes that we've seen in here as we go through. So the first one that I saw was that the signs and the works, right? It was mentioned that the people saw the signs and that this of healing the sick, and so that's why they followed him to the mountain. And at the end, after he feeds them, they saw the sign again, and they want to make him king. So again, that's the word sign, or the theme of signs is mentioned here in this short little chapter. Here we got the spirit and the water. The water was mentioned when they're on the boat. So we saw that. The also too is the world, the word world, right? He says, this is the prophet that has come into the world. They're repeating the word world here. That's ideas. He's entered into flesh. The other thing too is Passover. Obviously, Passover sacrifice. That theme is mentioned right there in verse 4. That's pretty clear. And then the last one, the I am, ego I me, that's mentioned here. We're starting to see that coming up as we get through the book of John. That's going to come up more and more. And even later on in chapter 6 as well. All right, so when we compare this with the prologue of John, the first 18 verses, there are also some themes that are mentioned here as well, even in a little short span. The first one I saw was light shines in the darkness, and they misunderstand it. In other words, they saw the sign and they still didn't see the sign. They didn't see the purpose of the sign. They're missing the boat, per se, right? The other one we see here, the word came to his. The word came to his own, and they did not receive him. So again, this is just a thing we're going to see throughout the book of John 6. They came. They're not seeing who he truly is. They just want to make him king. And of course, here we said the Torah points and is realizing Yeshua. They were seeing Moses. They saw the Passover, his miracles he did, the feeding of Elijah and Moses, but he's greater. Yeshua is greater than both those. Everything is realized in him. And so even in that short section, we can still go back to John chapter 1, verse 1 through 18. Okay? All right. So let's compare the book of John with the book of Revelation here. And even in this short section, we can see how the Revelation is related to this. Now this, This section I thought was pretty fascinating. There's some pretty fascinating connections here, but I want us to review the consecutive structure of the comparing from chapter 1 to chapter 1 to chapter 21 with chapter 21 going down the line, and then we had the chiastic structure as we've seen earlier, going from comparing chapter 1 to chapter 21 and going down the line with a cross. Now we're getting towards the middle of we're getting towards the middle of the book of John, so we're getting towards the middle of the book of Revelation. But there's some interesting connections here I want to share with you. So from a consecutive perspective, in John 6, 7 through 9, 200 denarii worth of bread, five barley loaves. Now, just as a reminder, when you see the green highlight, that means that this is referring to the same Greek word in both books, Book of John and Book of Revelation. But when you see the verse highlighted, that means this is the only time that Greek word is used in both books. Okay, so this is something special. So again, in John chapter 6, verse 7 to 9, it's highlighted because the Greek word for denarii and barley is only used only this time in Book of John. So in Book of Revelation is only used there as well. So what does Book of Revelation say? Well, in Revelation 6:6 it says, a quart of wheat for a denarius and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius. So this is referring to the famine that's going on from when he was breaking the 7 seals. Okay, so I think that's interesting. Also here in Book of John, again, another highlighted verse, 6:15 says, when Yeshua preached that they were, when Yeshua perceived that they were about to come and take him by force and make him king, he withdrew to a mountain by himself. Okay? So most likely the word mountain is the Greek word there that's unique. But in Revelation it says in 6:15, the kings, the great men, rich men, commanders, mighty men, hid themselves in the mountains. Okay? So you can kind of see how those two work. So Yeshua hid himself, but now that Yeshua comes, people hide themselves from Yeshua. It's kind of interesting how that works. Okay, so let's look at from a chiastic perspective with the book of Revelation and the book of John. In John 6, 3 and 10, it says, and Yeshua went up to the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples, in number about 5,000, meaning referring to the number of people there. Right, notice the word there's the verses are highlighted, meaning it's the only time the word is used. In the book of Revelation, it says in verse 14:1, I looked and behold a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000. Excuse me, 144,000. I think that's the only time the word thousand is used there in those two books. Okay. And then in John 6:19, and when they had rowed about 25 or 30 furlongs, they saw him walking on the sea. But in Revelation it says in 14:20 and 15:2, 1,600 furlongs I saw the one who overcame the beast standing on the sea. Interesting. So again, furlongs is the only time that word is used in both John and in Book of Revelation. So we'll see. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for this time that you've given us, the Shabbat, that we get to spend time with you and your word. Thank you for revealing us to what you want us to see, that Yeshua is our bread of life, that he is our sustainer, and the one who rescues us from the storms of the sea. May we continue to rely upon him and invite him to come into our boat every time we're in trouble, and that he's the only one who can calm the storms in our hearts, in our lives, to bring us closer to the destination of you. May we continue to look towards you and forget our natural world and look for you, the one who is in control and Lord of all the world. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen.